I'm Beverly Lindsay, the editor for Comparative and International Education, Leading Perspectives from the Field. This is a work that is compiled by fellows of the Comparative and International Education Society. We express appreciation to our editor, Milana Vernikova, and her colleagues in the United States and in India for the production team. The foreword by Ambassador and Professor Emeritus Horace Dawson. Ambassador Horace Dawson is unable to join us today, so he has requested that I, Beverly Lindsay, read an abstract version of his foreword. He encourages and hopes that everyone can see the longer version, which provides more in-depth material. Dr. Lindsay. I am pleased to share these remarks about comparative and international education, leading perspectives from the field, as read by the editor and an author, Dr. Beverly Lindsay. I arrived at Lincoln University, Pennsylvania in the fall of 1943. During the spring of that freshman year, and having reached age 18 in January, the newly official age of the draft, I was called to service in the United States Army. The entire academic year at Lincoln was to be my first extended trip away from home and then abroad. These travels were in conjunction with World War II. Our units were racially segregated. While white Americans called and demonstrated for victory, we as Negroes, including myself, did the same, but for a double V, victory at home and victory abroad. As a youngster and in the military, I took such issues seriously, resolving that I would be able to make a difference. I was not aware at the time that that was the beginning of my interest in different people and cultures and in foreign affairs. Even more relevant was the dropping of the atom bomb on Hiroshima. That occurred when we were in mid-ocean en route to Japan, bringing an end to the war. That alternative introduced me to yet another culture, but also left a lasting impression of the tremendous suffering among people in Japan. Not having been exposed to Asian culture, I may in the recesses of my mind vaguely thought of returning someday to Manila. Little did I realize that I would return decades later as a senior diplomat. I completed my BA at Lincoln and then my MA at Columbia University. In conjunction with my doctoral study at the University of Iowa, my twin interest in education and international affairs fused. My PhD dissertation focused on perceptions of the United States and Americans by international students who arrived in the country for the first time, and they would later leave. In the research process, I learned a great deal about media, education, and university systems in many countries, even as my subjects, quote unquote, learned about their experiences here in the United States. It was a pioneering study that came to the attention of Edward R. Murrow, one of the most renowned journalists whom President John F. Kennedy had selected as the director of the United States Information Agency, USIA. Murrow's surprise visit to Durham to interview me at what is now North Carolina Central University marked the beginning of a 25-year career in diplomatic services. I became cultural attaché in charge of educational affairs for the American Embassy in Uganda and continued in Lagos, Nigeria, the latter with a larger portfolio. After other diplomatic assignments, I was called to Washington, having been selected for the year-long senior seminar in foreign policy, designed for officers destined for the most senior ranks of the Foreign Service. Throughout much of the 7-year period in DC, I was an adjunct professor at the School of Journalism at the University of Maryland, College Park. In all these endeavors, the interactions between education and international affairs was paramount. This assignment was followed by my posting as Minister of Public and Cultural Affairs in Manila, Philippines, one of the largest diplomatic missions in the U.S. Foreign Service. At that time is one of the leading Fulbright programs. While in Manila, the call, quote unquote, came notifying me that President Jimmy Carter was nominating me to become the United States ambassador to Botswana. During this exciting period, the independence movement, the winds of change were everywhere, throughout Africa. As the ambassador to Botswana, I was the spokesperson for the contact group that was comprised of ambassadors from Canada, France, Germany, Nigeria, and the United States, countries integrally involved in moving along the peace process. On behalf of our home offices, we brought joint pressure for national independence. There were often delicate and highly confidential gatherings and activities involving political leaders, educators, and strategists trying to move independence forward. Many educators and international affairs specialists continued after national independence. The day after my retirement from the government, I joined the faculty at Howard University in DC. In a sense, I was returning to my earlier career where I could continue by working with undergraduate and graduate students in a range of disciplines. A program was established that led to the International Center named for Nobel Peace Laureate Dr. Ralph Johnson Bunche, a former Howard University professor who established the political science department and was a founding member of the editorial board of the Journal of Negro Education, which dealt with comparative education. I was the director of the Bunche Center for 20 years until my retirement from Howard. The scholars who write chapters in this book have demonstrated distinctions in their pursuit as professionals who tried continually to make the world a better place in the academy and numerous international venues. As observed in various chapters and online platforms, they have utilized their thorough academic, policy, and research skills to write numerous policy papers, publish articles and books, and administer multi-million dollars of educational and international programs. They have provided in-depth briefings and recommendations to the highest government officials such as presidents, prime ministers, cabinet members, and secretaries, ambassadors, and Congress and national parliaments, the World Bank, the United Nations, the European Union, the Southern African Development Fund, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and among others, have utilized their expertise. Their students have become ambassadors, presidents, prime ministers, university presidents, chief executive officers of international bodies and private and philanthropic organizations. In summary, this volume rekindles memories as a young soldier and a student at Lincoln University regarding how to make differences in the world. These scholars have made and are making extraordinary differences through their writings and have been at the forefront of outstanding contributions to comparative and international education for over 30 years. Dr. Lindsay and colleagues exemplify great administrative and intellectual skills for the magnificent way that they, as fellows of Comparative and International Education Society, have brought forth an impressive volume, Comparative and International Education, Perspectives from the Field. It is not just well done, but well done. Thank you. As we move to the preface, I will make a number of comments. And in particular, I express appreciation to the various contributors, to many people who are not contributing directly to the volume, but who offered very cogent and helpful comments on our various chapters. And we express appreciation to the funding agencies and others who have facilitated this work, including the universities where we are located. We think that this volume will be of particular interest not only in academic arenas, but also in non-government organizations, to federal agencies, to Congress, to Parliament, and to international agencies where some of us have worked, such as entities affiliated with the United Nations. Overall, we are concerned with educational missions writ large, which encompass teaching, scholarship, and public engagement. And this is especially important now as so many very favorable, but also, unfortunately, war and civil conflicts are occurring in several nations now. We also are presenting a version of this to the annual conference of the Comparative and International Education Society. So not only to professional conferences that also include the American Sociological Association, American Political Science, the Association of Black Sociologists, and other organizations. As we move to the next slide, we have a list of our contributors. So at this point, you can see from myself, from Ambassador Dawson, Dr. Arno, Dr. Carnoy, Dr. Evans, Dr. Ghosh, Dr. Ginsberg, Hayhoe, Dr. Hayhoe, Dr. Cleese, Dr. Semoff will all be involved in various ways with this recording, but at this current time, Dr. Stromquist has other engagements and will be unable to participate. We are now moving to the cover slide of our volume. On behalf of all of us as authors and contributors, I share the following information. In all instances, we have followed appropriate protocols, research protocols, policy protocols of our home universities and other organizations. We also went through appropriate research clearances. If these were funded or as these were funded by various agencies such as the Fulbright, Senior Fellowships, National Science Foundation, UNESCO, the World Bank, Ford Foundation, and other philanthropic organizations. Again, we ensured all appropriate research and policy protocols. With work that we did in other countries, the information for our research or our discussions that would be public information were cleared by the appropriate entities in those countries, such as ministries of education, ministries of research and science, Ministry of Health, and other similar entities, including non-government organizations. So in short, we adhere to all appropriate protocols for research and policy. We also ensured that graduate and doctoral students for research and other organizations and universities were apprised and that they were fully cooperative. So we appreciate the support and assistance both in the United States and other parts. Finally, I mentioned that while our presentations, our written presentations and chapters contain extensive material, they also contain all appropriate citations and references, even though they will not be heard in our oral presentations. Thank you. This is our table of contents, the landscape for comparative and international education. As you will hear or have heard in the recording by Ambassador Dawson, he discusses some of the origins of this work and mentions the accomplishments of all of us as fellows of the Comparative and International Education Society. We think it is very important for senior scholars such as ourselves to share our knowledge and expertise in various domestic and international settings. Each of the presenters will be presenting in parts 1, 2, and 3 of our volume, which will be very important, or it will be very important, that they will identify some of the major themes that are listed in the title of the section they're on, but also reflected in their very brief presentation. So for example, part 1 entails conceptual, historical, and theoretical frameworks for the field. And this is done in order to enrich the field, to add to the current knowledge, but move forward. So examples of historical reasons for testing will be presented, how different agencies view education in different settings. So those questions will be raised and addressed in part by several authors. We see in part 2, for example, there will be pedagogical, epistemologies, gender and global engagements. And Professors Ghosh, and Ginsberg will be talking, and a central focus here are some of the issues around pedagogy and teaching. Our next section, or section rather, part 3, will be presented by several of us dealing with policies, practices, and paradigms emerging from applied research. It's very important to engage in research and understand the relationships between policies and practices. But ultimately, it's to improve education and public policies in a variety of settings. So Dr. Evans, Samoff, and I will be presenting. In the final section, I will be making some comments and will give the various contributors chances to respond briefly to the comments that have been mentioned prior to that. And I will mention again, if we go back to part 1, that Professor Carnoy, the Vitus Jacobs Professor at Stanford University, will be the first presenter, followed by Dr. Cleese at the University of Maryland, College Park, and Dr. Hayhoe from the University of Toronto. Dr. Carnoy.
My essay in this wonderful book is about the evolution of comparative international education during my academic lifetime, from the end of the 1950s until the present. Comparative education went through a series of major shifts during this period. One of the great features of this book is that it presents a number of different perspectives on these shifts by those who made major contributions to them. You'll hear from a number of them in this presentation. During the first part of this period, in the 1950s and 1960s, comparative education became much more important because of the Cold War and the interests in the US and Europe to focus on economic development as a counter to communism. Education was seen as a way to promote economic growth and democracy. Social science was also being pushed as a way to study education because of this emphasis on economic development. And pressure to gather more data also led to the first international tests in the mid-1960s. Those tests were not meant to directly compare the quality of education in different countries, but rather to provide an empirical basis for understanding the impact of various educational policies across countries. By the 1970s, the same social science approach led to a new kind of analysis in comparative education, a critical analysis of education's role in colonialism and reproducing inequality. Some of us began writing about the political economy of education, especially about education in the context of state theory. Others developed world society theory, a way of looking at educational systems comparatively in the context of an overarching world culture or ideology. With increased globalization and the more active role of international agencies such as the World Bank, UNESCO, and eventually the OECD, the locus of comparative education shifted to those institutions. In the 1980s, the World Bank was probably doing as much research in comparative education as all the leading universities combined. The common theme of that research, as back in the 1960s, was education as an input into economic growth. By the end of the 1990s, however, it was the international testing agencies, the IEA with its TIMSS test, and then the OECD with its PISA test, which began to dominate the field and set the agenda. Even UNESCO got into testing, focusing on Latin America and Africa. Clearly, today the OECD's PISA is where a major locus of comparative education lies. And as usual, the driving force and rationale behind its message of improving educational quality through comparative analysis is economic growth. PISA has largely reduced comparative analysis of educational systems to ranking countries' educational quality by the average scores students receive on the PISA test, rather than trying to understand the nature of educational systems in different countries and how they're linked to social and economic policies there. I argue that the second major locus for comparative education today is impact evaluation, which is being done largely in universities, and with it, impact investment being done by large financial institutions moving into the education field. All of this has the same narrow effectiveness rationale as pushed by the OECD. My essay ends with a simple question. Whatever happened to theory in comparative education? The dominant modes of study in comparative education today are largely atheoretical. I appeal to the younger generation to bring theory back and to bring it back in political economic forms, as well as to support it with sound empirical work. Indeed, even using test results to better understand what education systems are really doing in different nations to make things better or worse for the mass of young people. Thank you, Beverly, for allowing us to get together and do this great book. And I want to now turn it over to my colleagues in section 1 of the book, Steve Cleese and Ruth Hayhoe.
Thank you. Dr. Arnold has now joined us. Bob.
Well, essentially my presentation is based on the work I've done overseas, and beginning with, for example, the Ford Foundation in Bogota, Colombia, where I began to write about the philanthropic foundations and new forms of cultural imperialism. At the same time, based on my work in Latin America, I also began to look at the effect of these organizations or world systems analysis on my research, and that you could not understand what was happening in the education system of any country without understanding its strategic position in international political economy and also in terms of political strategic relationships. From there, I went on to looking at, among other things, the promise of socialist revolutions and what could be expected of an education system. And actually, after rather disappointing experiences in both Nicaragua and Venezuela, I've come to the conclusion that there are certain things that you maybe expect of a education system, but things that you can't expect, but that necessarily you're going to produce an entirely new person or a new political economy. But there are certain things that you can expect, including the development of analytical skills, aesthetic sensibilities, ethical commitments. And then I moved on to what I've been doing in terms of textbooks, major textbooks in English language in the field of comparative ed, and now going into a 5th edition of comparative education, the dialectic of the global and the local, with the companion second piece on emergent trends. And in that, my contributions have been basically to focus on the dimensions of our field, which are the scientific, theoretical, contributing to theory building. Second, what we can learn from theory building in terms of amelioration or helping to improve systems. And third, the international global dimensions of promoting, hopefully, international peace and understanding through our work. Then finally, in terms of work with my philosopher colleague at Indiana University, Barry Bull, I've been talking about not only the empirical, but the ethical dimensions of our field and how we could use case studies to look at to what extent reforms carried out and lead to honoring the dignity of the individuals being educated. So that's sort of a thumbnail sketch of what my chapter deals with. And I have to say, I've collaborated over the years with Joel and Ruth and also Steve. We've all been, we've been working closely together over the years, and we've fed off one another. I mean, Steve, you go back when you were in AI, and of course we taught in media school at Stanford University, and Joel and I have been colleagues. And I have to say, Joel also had a very interesting special edited edition of the Comparative Ed Review on socialist reforms and what you could or not expect from them. So I hope I wasn't too brief, but I think I essentially summed up what was in my chapter.
Thank you, Bob, for those comments. Steve, please.
Thank you, Beverly. Thank you, Martin. In my chapter, which is called Economics, Development, and Comparative International Education, I took advantage of what you might call this Elders Speak book, for this elder to speak of what I see as the big picture, implied by what I've been writing about for the past 4 decades or more. My work is centered on the role of economics in education and development, critiquing dominant perspectives. I try to capture what is wrong with these dominant views and what are the alternatives to it. Despite postmodernism, I think it's still useful to talk about grand meta-narratives. Simplifying, I see 2 broad ones in economics: neoclassical economics versus a more critical political economy perspective. All neoclassical economists believe in capitalism, in particular, the efficiency of a market system subject to some intervention by government. Within neoclassical economics, there are 2 main currents: liberals, who see lots of reasons for government intervention, and neoliberals, who decry government interference. Lately, I've been reading a new book, Thinking Like an Economist, by Berman, where she argues that neoclassical economics reasoning for the past 50 years, especially the neoliberal version, has severely limited which policy options are on the table, restricting them to those that can be justified by an efficiency cost-benefit calculus, ignoring rationales of human rights, morality, and equity. I go further than Berman, arguing that economic efficiency is an empty concept in theory and useless in practice. It serves principally as an ideological bulwark to justify a capitalist market system. The alternative meta-narrative of political economy focuses on the harm and limits caused by the intersection of societal structures like capitalism, patriarchy, racism, and ableism. From this perspective, mainstream policy analysis and public sector decision-making are captured by neoliberal and to some extent liberal ideology. The hope for progressive social change lies mostly in human agency challenging that hegemony, mostly through social movements. In the area of international development, a problematic term, related meta-narratives play out, with the dominant one buying into Margaret Thatcher's TINA, there is no alternative to capitalism or neoliberal capitalism, which they see as having given us unprecedented progress, increased material wealth, and reduced poverty. Education for all, and more broadly, the MDGs and the SDGs, and our progress toward achieving them show the world's commitment to continuing improvements. The combined efforts of the public and private sectors will eventually transform our world into a much better standard of living. The counter-narrative to this argues capitalism and other structures maintain, legitimate, and reproduce a world of poverty, inequality, racism, sexism, environmental destruction, and militarism. EFA, the MDGs, and the SDGs may be well-intentioned, but they are not serious efforts, as illustrated by the lack of achievement of any of the goals, their constant postponement, and the vast shortfall of resources needed. The hope for progressive change again lies in social movements and in the many on-the-ground alternatives, large and small, around the world that challenge this hegemony. To conclude, comparative and international education has long been captured by the dominant meta-narrative of economics and development. Agencies like the World Bank along with others, bilaterals, multilaterals, universities, think tanks. Spread that ideology globally. Fortunately, that meta-narrative has been resisted and challenged from the beginnings of comparative and international education, as a number of the authors do in this book. I've helped found an organization called the Alternatives Project. Check it out and sign our statement if you would, which has set up a very, among other things, has set up a very successful thematic track, sponsoring many panels at the last 3 Comparative and International Education Society meetings under the label 21st Century Socialism in Education, Global Alternatives to Patriarchy, Racial Capitalism, Militarism, and Climate Change. Over the last 50 years, I have written about these debates and urge you to check out some of my work in this book, and especially in my recent book called The Conscience of a Progressive, which examines these debates on a host of topics, including education, healthcare, the environment, economics, poverty and inequality, development, war and violence, and their intersections with issues of gender, race, ethnicity, and ability. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing my colleagues speak.
Thank you, Steve. Now we will turn to Dr. Hayhoe.
It's a great pleasure for me to follow such influential scholars as Martin Carnoy, Robert Arnove, and Steve Cleese, whose chapters appear before mine in the first section of this book. I couldn't agree more with Martin's emphasis on the need for theory. And I've been inspired by the ways in which such critical Marxist theories as dependency and world system theory have been used to identify and analyze the ongoing inequities in global education and the ways education has tended to reinforce them. However, I found this lens less helpful than expected when I moved to Hong Kong in 1967, just as the violence of China's Cultural Revolution began to explode. In looking at China's exposure to imperialism over the 20th century, I was surprised to discover the most extreme experience came with the imposition of Soviet educational patterns, which were essentially Western after its 1949 revolution. Within a decade, the Russian experts were sent home as Soviet social imperialists. We can understand that a bit now with the Ukraine situation. And China dissolved into a decade of self-imposed violence with a cultural revolution against the top-down pressures from highly specialized Soviet patterns. Only with the death of Mao and the rise of Deng Xiaoping were they able to open up to modernization, the world, and the future, to use Deng Xiaoping's own words on this. In this situation, I turn to African and Asian theorists, such as Ali Mesrui, Rashni Kothari, Ashish Nandi, and Samuel Kim, who established the World Order Models Project. I love its acronym, WOMP, in the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in New Delhi, India, in the 1970s, the early 70s. And they developed a structural theory of imperialism. They challenged the global north to establish a new international economic order. So my chapter highlights this theoretical frame, which has been given less attention in comparative education in the Western world. If comparative education has been dominated by Western-derived theories, comparative higher education suffered even more from assumptions that higher education began with the universities of medieval Europe and ignorance of rich Asian traditions going back so much earlier, which had a significant influence on Europe when scholars like Matteo Ricci first translated Chinese classics into Latin and introduced the Chinese concept of meritocracy and civil service examinations for selecting students. Then there was the enrichment of the normal university in post-Confucian contexts as an ethically engaged university that can stand against the pressures of global ranking and the audit culture. But it's been forgotten in the English-speaking world. Another example is Malaysia's Accelerated Program for Excellence, APEX. And here I quote what they set up. The idea of being world-class is not defined by dominant neoliberal concerns of occupying better positions in university rankings or league tables, but in terms of addressing and providing sustainable solutions to the more immediate global problems in the areas of healthcare and poverty. And that is a quote from APEX. The limitations of both Marxism and modernization theory became clear in the 1990s when the clash and subsequent dialogue of civilizations demonstrated the importance of religion to communities around the world. Far from dying out as an opiate of the people no longer needed, or as a traditional mindset left behind in the evolution of society, it has become a vital source of spiritual energy in addressing challenges such as climate change and responding to the Sustainable Development Goals. In my most recent co-edited book entitled Religion and Education, it's great to have chapters by Catherine Marshall and also by our colleague Ratna Ghosh, who's here today and appears later in this volume, that illustrate the vital contribution of religious education in countering violent extremism and energizing efforts towards equity, diversity, and inclusion. My chapter thus ends with highlighting the importance of religion in our current comparative education research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hayhoe. At this time, we're going to go to section 2, where Professors Ghosh and Ginsberg will be discussing pedagogical, gender, and global engagement issues with reference to teachers and universities. Professor Ghosh.
Thank you, Beverly. It has been an exciting experience for me to be involved in this project with leaders in the field of comparative and international education. We hope that this interdisciplinary volume will help emerging professionals expand the field of CIE to advance equity and justice in the world. Written at a time when COVID was causing a crisis, unprecedented in recent times, my chapter, Can Education Contribute to Social Cohesion?, touches on the significant role of education in developing ethical and critical, global-minded citizens who will work towards peace and sustainable development through social cohesion in an interdependent world. From the point of view of education, the issue of social cohesion is rather complex because it raises a variety of issues dealing with policy, process, practice, as well as outcome. The overall question is, can there be lasting peace without social justice and social cohesion? I argue that education has the potential and the obligation to prepare future generations for responsible behavior towards a more equitable and socially cohesive world. COVID-19 has shown us, like never before, that we need to cooperate in this health emergency. We need to understand that no country comes first, and the rich and powerful are not immune to the virus. It can hit everyone, although the privileged have different experiences. We have encountered the need for concerted action at times of crisis, terrorism, natural disasters, and several health pandemics, which have threatened personal, national, and global security. The question is how to sustain this kind of cohesive effort. We need global-minded citizens because social cohesion will keep us safe and strong as a group to overcome the challenges in preserving this planet. Furthermore, in this emergency, physical distancing has required us to develop new ways of living and communicating, which involve new technologies. With the focus on digital ways of communicating, it is important that we do not neglect the human and emotional qualities of care and compassion. Globalization and technological advancement have accelerated the pace of international migration and refugees from various parts of the world. Teachers are confronted with the multidimensional complexity of diversity and their intersections, and differences among students pose a significant challenge in providing fair and equitable learning experiences to them. It is of utmost importance how teachers treat difference. Difference is not discussed enough in teacher education programs and is often equated with deficiency. Sensitivity to differences is required by teachers who may not be aware how differences must be recognized and treated. If the medium is the message, to quote Marshall McLuhan, then teachers are crucial to making education inclusive of all differences and abilities. New liberal educational aims have focused on the cognitive at the expense of the affective domain, such as compassion and care for student well-being and mental health. Students need to be able to respond easily to change and be resilient, which is the capacity to overcome changes ethically and have coping skills that resist negative attitudes and behaviors, such as hate and discrimination. Most importantly, teachers need a student-centered philosophy of teaching so that students see the relevance of what they learn and are able to develop a critical understanding of an interdependent world, a sense of belonging to both local and global societies, and responsibility towards preserving this planet. It is vital to carefully consider the type of education because education can be used for different purposes. In this chapter, I stress the need for humanistic education to deal with contemporary challenges, along with the essential skills for economic security. I briefly touch on two Southern philosophies that can guide nonviolent, whole child, and inclusive education, which focus on social cohesion. Social institutions like schools and universities have not been sufficiently supported to effectively foster resilience in students for social cohesion. Thank you, Beverly.
I want to thank Beverly for organizing this book and putting up with all of us as we were producing our chapters and providing feedback to others. The focus of my chapter follows very nicely some of the points that Ratna made. What I try to do in this chapter is call attention to the importance of teachers. I start with a summary of some of the recent decades of statements by multilateral organizations and other key individuals about the importance of teachers in achieving quality education. And by that, I don't just mean in achieving cognitive outcomes, the socio-emotional and affective areas that Ratna mentioned. But at the same time, I look at the field of comparative education, in particular at the textbooks that have been produced over the last decade, last century or so, and I, with apologies to colleagues in other countries and whose language is not mainly English, I focused only on English language textbooks in our field. And I mentioned that CIES, the US-based Comparative Ed Society, and the UK Society really started with a very close relationship to teachers and teacher education organizations. But since in recent decades, that relationship has become much more tenuous, if even existing. But what I focus on is the ways in which textbooks, English language comparative education textbooks, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and even before that, gave attention to teachers. But then in the 1980s, and particularly during the decade of 2010, the textbooks that were produced then did not include any chapters focused specifically on teachers. Teachers, of course, were mentioned in passing, but not a specific focus on teachers or teacher education. There was, in the 90s and 2000, somewhat of a more attention to teachers, but to me, the teachers became kind of the absent present, something that everybody made reference to, but didn't give much attention on. At the same time, I spend time in this chapter reviewing some of the writings, book-length writings, that have focused on teachers. In particular, I look at writings that focused on pre-service teacher preparation, on in-service teacher development, on teachers' work and occupational status, teachers' professional association and unions, teachers' engagement in educational reform, and teachers' involvement in community and societal change. There clearly is a extensive body of book-length writings about teachers, but again, that doesn't seem to get captured as much in the textbooks that have been developed for our field. There's obviously some textbooks that include teachers and some that don't. As a result of this analysis, I come to the conclusion, which, to be perfectly honest, was a conclusion I had before I did the analysis, that we need to devote more attention to teachers and teacher education and comparative education textbooks. At least many of our students in courses in comparative ed are current or former teachers, but I think they would be surprised how little attention there's given to their profession and their professional development. And finally, I conclude by quoting Isaac Kandel in what I still think is a very important textbook in comparative education, originally published in 1993. He gives considerable attention to teachers at what he describes as the questions that are fundamental to the progress of education. And I quote him at length here, what is the place of teacher in society and in the education system? What should be the character of teacher preparation and the relation of academic to professional training? What should be the part of the teacher in promoting educational progress? How much freedom or maybe autonomy should the teacher enjoy? How much supervision and inspection are desirable? So in a way, I'm returning to his plea to give considerable attention to teachers and teacher education in comparative education textbooks. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this book and to participate in this presentation.
Thank you, Mark. In our next section, we're looking at policies, practices, and paradigms emerging from applied research and the linkages therein. We will hear from Dr. Evans, Dr. Samoff, and Dr. Lindsay. Dr. Evans.
Thank you, Beverly. I'm honored to be part of this distinguished group of CIES fellows who contributed to this book. My chapter moves from the larger conceptual frameworks discussed in other chapters to the experience of one comparative education program. In the chapter, I reflect on the challenges faced in the creation and the 50-year history of the Center for International Education at UMass Amherst, which I will refer to as CIE. CIE was created in the late 1960s, a time of change and optimism. Domestically, there was great interest in reforming education with new technologies. Internationally, there was a belief in education's ability to contribute significantly to the development of new nations. At its beginning, CIE faced three strategic questions. First, what should be the balance between applied project work and academic research and training? Should degree programs be involved directly in the national development process? This struggle was not unique to CIE. In 1968, after several years of debate, our society changed its name from comparative education to comparative and international education, thereby broadening its membership to include the large group of professionals engaged in development education. Universities are often uncomfortable with combining academic and development contract work, feeling that they should be kept separate to preserve academic freedom and integrity. Most universities have opted to have projects and contract work located in units separate from academic units. Martin Carnoy, in his chapter and in much more detail in his book, examined the history of the SIDAC program at Stanford. In the book, he traces debates at Stanford as the emphasis shifted back and forth between academic and applied, ultimately remaining largely on the academic side. The case of CIE, the founding group of faculty and students, however, felt strongly that having direct involvement in development would produce a synergy between the academic and the applied that would strengthen both. It would also attract students who wanted to continue to work in development. A second question, how should colleges of education begin to internationalize their programs? Should the international component be located in one subunit, or should the internationalization be spread across all programs? In his chapter, John Schwille discusses how Michigan State addressed the issue, ultimately by seeking to internationalize all programs. CIE chose to create a separate subunit, but did reach out to other programs to involve faculty and graduate students. The third question was more unique to CIE. How could a program in what was then a mediocre school of education in a state university which had, at best, a modest reputation, begin to attract quality faculty and students? In order to compete with Harvard, Columbia, and Stanford, CIE had to offer an alternative that would attract students and faculty who otherwise would never have considered coming to UMass. How did CIE go about creating such a program? Its primary strategy was twofold. First, to combine active involvement in development projects with the academic program, and second, to establish an active, internationally diverse, participatory learning community where students were treated as learning resources as much as learners. CIE began by recruiting graduate students and faculty with direct field experience. Admission to degree programs required at least 1 year of development education field experience, in addition to the usual academic qualifications. Ultimately, many students who came were mid-career practitioners with years of experience. CIE created a highly participatory learning community with graduate students involved not only as learners, but as curriculum developers, as co-teachers in courses, as staff writing project proposals, and managing and sometimes working directly on development project. Overall, CIE's approach is best illustrated by the concept of deep practitioner, a term coined by two of our graduate students. The goal of CIE's program was to produce graduates who have both the skills needed to be effective leaders working directly in development education settings, and a working knowledge of theories, research methods, and M&E techniques needed to understand what they were doing. So what has CIE accomplished in its 50-year history? It has produced a worldwide network of about 600 graduates, many of whom occupy significant positions of leadership, working in development agencies, becoming senior officials in national education systems, or as founders and leaders of NGOs working in development or on social justice issues. Surprisingly, given the applied nature of the program, about a third have found careers working as university faculty and administrators. Over the years, CIE managed projects worth almost $100 million, resulting in significant revenue for the college and university and enabling CIE to support many graduate students. Equally important, CIE's projects provided it with the financial support that was essential for it to survive for 50 years in a state land-grant university whose charter is primarily to serve the needs of Massachusetts. In conclusion, CIE is a product of a unique time and context which is unlikely to be reproduced elsewhere. However, there are principles and lessons from its strategies that can be used by those starting new programs or to strengthen existing programs, regardless of their emphasis. It has been a great journey that I'm lucky to have been involved in.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. Now we turn to Dr. Samoff.
Thank you, Beverly, and thank you, colleagues. Like many of my colleagues, I took this opportunity to participate in this set of reflections by colleagues in comparative education to reflect on comparative education itself. And as I did that, it seemed to me there are two stories that sit side by side. The first might be called the development tale, a story that has its roots in the decolonization that began early in the 20th century. Prior to that, education was deeply enmeshed in the colonial process, and it played a role in creating moral legitimacy for immoral practices in that era. But with decolonization, there emerged a notion of development, a notion of progress, that line of progress from less to more, and therefore for education, a particularly important purpose, a central role in that understanding of development, a central role in improving the quality of life and improving the standard of living of people around the world. And that became, as Martin mentioned in his talk, in his comments, a central feature of comparative education. And I think that intensified as the 20th century unfolded, particularly with the new institutions at the end of World War II and the emergence of UNESCO as the global organization for education, science, and culture. And there emerged then even, that was further intensified as the Cold War emerged with the notion of a development gap. And in the competition between the Soviet Union and the United States, education became a vehicle for addressing what was called the development gap, and of course for the allocation of foreign aid. And that led then to a new phenomenon, the conjunction of foreign aid funding and research on comparative education, which I've addressed elsewhere in my work as the creation of a financial intellectual complex. And that's particularly important and remains important in the area where I work, particularly in Africa. Foreign aid funding is the principal source of funding for comparative education research. That's true in much of the rest of the world, directly and indirectly as well. And what that means is that the research funders become the major arbiters of research quality. The issue here is the research process, not simply selecting topics, but determining what it is that is regarded as high quality research, credible research, legitimate research that's worthy of attention. And it's that research process that becomes the heavy focus of what's happening in comparative and international education. By the end of the 20th century, though, in this story, there's a problem, and that is that the development gap is not closing. That inequality in the world, inequality and injustice are increasing, and that sets the stage for the emergence of a second story. As Martin pointed out, the second story really has much earlier roots, but it becomes clearer as it situates itself as a critique of the first story, of the development story. This second story then is a deconstruction story. It's about demystification and necessarily about liberation and transformation. Think of Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, or Martin Carnoy's Education as Cultural Imperialism, Bowles and Ginta's work in exploring how education functions to reproduce a particular sort of political, economic, and social order. Think of the work of Lewin on the pressures to privatize and the ways in which privatization further impoverishes those already poor, or Steve Klee's really insightful work on the distorted uses of human capital theory and the economics more generally. The point then is this second story is not so much a story, but a series of strands that come together as a critique of the paradigm and of the assumptions of the mainstream of comparative education. For example, a challenge to the notion that the global north is the primary generator and owner of knowledge. For example, a challenge to the notion that the model for social science research should be an experiment and all that that encompasses. The second story then, as I've said, is not primarily a coherent story, but a series of strands that are critical and that start with the notion that if inequality and injustice in the world persist, then there must be powerful forces that regard that as to their advantage. The global inequality is not an accident. It's not an inadvertent outcome or simply slow progress, but clearly the result of conscious efforts, conscious actions by individuals and institutions. And that poses then for us as scholars in comparative and international education, the challenge of a choice to be complicit in that process or the choice to challenge it. For Africa, the question is far less, how did Africa get poor, which is usually how it's posed. Why is Africa poor, which is usually how it's posed, but rather, how did Africa get poor? How is it that Africa went from being an affluent part of the world to a poor part of the world, and what keeps it that way? And for comparative and international education, it seems to me, it's essential to distinguish between poor and impoverished. And it's essential as well to understand why that distinction matters. Thank you, Beverly.
Thank you, Joel. And now we will move to me, Beverly Lindsay, on my chapter 12. My chapter is going to be somewhat different from the presentations that have been made thus far because mine is evolving nexus between diplomacy and comparative and international education. And this kind of nexus was identified over half a century ago by Philip Coombs and Charles Frankel. These issues are also at the forefront when we look at some of the discussions and activities on education and climate change and health conditions in G7 and G20 nations, and their respective national and international organizations and entities also reflect this. My presentation essentially has 4 parts or 4 objectives. One is to articulate various concepts and dimensions of diplomacy and soft power. 2, examining select American and British university rankings and league tables, something that Ruth Hayhoe briefly touched upon. 3, portraying domestic and geopolitical matters via the explication of how various American and British government agencies and philanthropic foundations are affected by diplomacy and foreign policy via their missions, funding, priorities, etc. for education. And finally, number 4, fusing diplomacy and international education. In essence, these are the evolving nexuses among the phenomena that influence our field. The concepts of diplomacy and soft power really began at the end of the 19th and early 20th century, but they really became more widespread after World War I and World War II, massive destruction and wars. In fact, Ambassador Dawson alludes to this as a soldier in World War II. Basically, diplomacy attempts to explain and understand each other's values, purposes, and policies, and to establish intellectual connections between one's own and foreign countries. But this also entails what we refer to as multi-track diplomacy, involving education, cultural affairs, the corporate world, religious institutions, private citizens, the arts, athletics. We can also think of what Arthur Ashe did in terms of tennis diplomacy in South Africa, or ping pong diplomacy with China. Simultaneously, there are philanthropic organizations that are engaged in a variety of forms of diplomacy, although not always explicitly labeled as such. Within the United States, one of the major public diplomacy programs is the Fulbright program. In fact, this current academic year is the 75th anniversary of the Fulbright program that emerged from transferring war funds from the Department of Defense to the State Department to engage in people-to-people diplomacy. But that largely involved universities and nonprofit organizations, but also people in the arts and in the humanities. The British government similarly established and updated its British Council. It's a charitable organization, but it was set up largely, or at least initially, to deal with a number of its colonies in terms of teachers, English language education, and the like. It's private, or let me rephrase that. It's a charity which has a different meaning than charities in the United States, but it is very, very closely aligned with the British Parliament and whoever is in power at the time. Joseph Nye of Harvard University discusses soft power as a form of diplomacy, namely try to interact cooperatively with other nations on the macro level and contribute to mutual understanding rather than using force. One of the examples that is quite prominent now is in the area of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And more recently, we can add STEAM, science, technology, engineering, arts, and mathematics. So these go beyond boundaries. Our second major part deals with university rankings and league tables, as Dr. Hayhoe mentioned. And the United States, it's the US News and World Report, and the National Research Council in London, which is used throughout the world, is the Higher Education League Tables. And universities throughout the world are trying to maintain and or move up on the London's league tables and or in the United States, the National Research Council. A disproportionate amount of the federal funding and national funding in the United States and in England or the United Kingdom are from very select universities. For example, the Association of American Universities, which is at the top of many league tables, it's the Stanfords, the UCLAs, University of Texas, Austin, University of Pennsylvania, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, receives 60% of all federal research funds. The Russell Group, which is the 24 elite universities in the United Kingdom, receives 68% of the top research. So there is a synergy there. And because they're major research universities, they also have input initially into what the National Science Foundation decides to fund. There is objective 3, which is the convergence of domestic and geopolitical policies with international and government agencies. And I will briefly mention the role of Ralph Bunche, who was the first African-American awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating between Israel and 4 of its Arab neighbors, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, who obtained his doctorate, the first African-American to do so, in political science from Harvard University. He worked very closely at Howard University in establishing the Journal of Negro Education, which built upon his work from his doctoral dissertation in West Africa. He later worked, as we know, with the United Nations, was the undersecretary, and helped establish a number of the affiliate organizations such as UNESCO. We could also mention the United States Agency for International Agents, United States Agency for International Development, USAID, which Dr. Evans discusses in his chapter. In England, it's the Department for International Development, DFID, which recently changed its name, but the majority of the funding from DFID goes to elite universities such as University College London, King's College, and various branches of the newer red brick colleges. Philanthropic organizations, the Ford Foundation is probably the grandparent of all of the foundations that distributes worldwide funding, and it really emerged after World War II. and to work with the Marshall Plan in Europe, again, philanthropic dealing with government. MacArthur Foundation, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and newer ones such as the Bloomberg Foundation. In the United Kingdom, it's the Wellcome Trust, founded in the 1930s, interestingly enough, by an American, and it deals with London and University College London and Imperial College. The vast majority of their funds for universities and all, in fact, have gone to Russell Group universities, the top 24. Objective 4 was fusing diplomacy and international educational studies. I've just presented 3 objectives where this occurs, and I can reiterate with UNESCO, USAID, DFID, and the foundations such as Bloomberg, Gates, and the like. Their missions and statements receive input from the public. But one of the areas that my chapter discusses is who are now the CEOs of these foundations. At Bloomberg, Ford, and Gates over the last couple of years, all of the CEOs have been people of color and or women. It does raise the question touched upon by Ratna Ghosh in her chapter of inclusiveness and what this means in this setting in terms of philanthropical foci and what it will be doing in the fields of education and human development. So basically, we can end by stating and paraphrasing a statement from the former president of the University of Pennsylvania, Judith Rodin, and I quote, "It is important that universities really understand what it means to be a global institution, so they know what democracy looks like in its various sectors and what roles they can and should be playing." When we take into account her view, we can combine it with the original statements I cited by Combs and Frankel in terms of universities' roles in foreign policy and diplomacies, while integrating contemporary knowledge and more innovative applied policy research, which is also the foci of this particular section. So that is the comments I would make. We do have a part 4, which is moving forward in the new decades. But before I make any comments, I know that Steve and a couple of others have communicated that they might wish to share a few comments on some of the other presenters. So Steve, if you have comments, you may begin.
Thanks, Beverly. Great presentations, a great book that you helped put together and led us through. A number of us in the presentations today and our work see that the field is contested terrain, that the field and other fields associated with it are in struggle. There are 2 big stories. And I think a lot of people who are going to view this video and read the book are students in the comparative education field. And if you're uncomfortable with that dominant paradigm, I just want to urge you to look for alternatives. That's what a number of us were talking about, alternatives in theory and alternatives in practice. And there's lots out there to look at. I think of Boaventura Sousa Santos' epistemologies of the South. I think back to Freire. I think of my work in Brazil and how much alternative practices there are with the citizen school movement, the landless movement schools, programs for street children, and more broadly, critical pedagogy, democratic schooling, social justice education. I guess my comment is there's lots of alternatives out there, and I hope that the field looks more closely at them, and I hope that new people in the field take that to heart. We're in such an interesting field that is at the intersection of almost everything I can think of. Last comment is Harold Noah from Teachers College once said that the comparative advantage of comparative education was education. To me, then and now, it's border crossing, that we cross all these borders in our field and therefore consider issues that maybe other fields don't. Thank you, Beverly.
Thank you, Steve. Does anyone else wish to make brief comments before mine? Bob, Arnulf, and then Joel, I think you raised your hand. Bob,
With regard to Steve's last comment about border crossings, actually in the earlier textbooks I did with Outback and Kelly, we talked about our field as being very loosely bounded. And I think that was a good description of how we draw from different fields, paradigms, quantitative methodologies to really try to understand education and its interactions with all the different domains surrounding it. And I thought that was just a very nice analogy, Steve. So yes, I agree with that.
Joel,
Sure. I think, Steve, you're absolutely right. There are alternatives, and we need to be looking for and add alternatives. I think we need to add to that, though, a follow-up, and that is, why is it that so little of the field, as you tell it, is looking at alternatives? And therefore, we need to be in our own self-reflection, in our own critical self-reflection, looking at what is the process or what are the processes that create in this, what I've called the mainstream story and what I think Martin called the mainstream and the countercurrents, that is. Why does the mainstream remain the mainstream? And I think we've had far too little attention to why the mainstream remains the mainstream, and far too little attention to the ways in which even those of us who see ourselves as more critical of what's going on, nonetheless help to perpetuate if we don't pay attention to the ways in which we understand and communicate to our students the research process. The research process itself, by design, is fundamentally conservative. And if we don't challenge that, then we will 5 years from now have the same discussion, or 10 years or 20 years. So border crossing, of course, but why are there those borders, and why are they so strong? I say that to follow up because in my work, I spent some time in the early 1960s looking at efforts in Africa to reconstruct the disciplines, to change those borders and make other borders prominent. And effectively, in political terms, that failed. The disciplines prevailed. And so we need to understand better why that is and how that works and how we end up being complicit in maintaining patterns that we think should change.
thank you, Joel. Does anyone else wish to make very brief comments before I move toward a synthesis? If not, I'd like to highlight a few points that the several of you made, beginning with Martin's, because he ended his presentation and the 15-minute one we did last week for the CIES conference site, urging scholars, and particularly, I would say, the millennials and Gen X and now Gen Z, to really take into account theoretical and conceptual frameworks to frame and to examine much of what we look at. We are also familiar, of course, with meta-analysis. In other words, it certainly is taking in a wide variety of data and what we wish to do with it. Just as a point of information, a number of acronyms were mentioned, such as EFA, Education for All, SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, and the like. So we do have a glossary in our actual book where you can look up these terms. The comments by Drs. Ginsburg and Ghosh dealing with teachers. One of the issues that strikes me now is the problems we're having now in the United States with what teachers can teach without being censored in terms of LGBTQIA, in terms of border crossing, somewhat different from what Joel and Steve and Bob mentioned, but those are really important issues. And it puts a number of the teachers at jeopardy. Also, the whole issue of what textbooks can now be taught, not only in American schools, but I had my last Fulbright in Myanmar about 2 years before the coup d'etat. So there's a real issue of what teachers and even at the university professionals can engage in. The other issue I would mention was internationalization across programs, which John Swilley, who's not here, Dave Evans mentioned, and I certainly discussed in my chapter, because there is the issue of what belongs to what discipline, rather than looking at it or examining it at the macro level, at university levels, or even in consortiums. For example, the University of Massachusetts, Smith College, and the like, and consortiums in California, where I am now, physically not there, but I'm still on their payroll, work together and move beyond just the confines of fields. This does have some limitations, though, particularly for assistant and associate professors when they come up for evaluation and tenure. There's some very critical issues there that will affect them. But I will move now to part 4, which is moving forward in the new decade. We are now in the 3rd decade of the 21st century. So we're 22 years in. We have seen, and I started my presentation by talking about G7, G20 nations and areas that cross border, the migration from South America and Central America to the United States. I'm in California now. We have to constantly deal with issues of quote unquote traditional migrants, but also newer people coming from Afghanistan and now Ukraine. These have vast impact for education in the home countries, and if they're moving to us in the United States, are moving from Africa and North Africa, for example, to different countries. Another issue that I discuss in the final chapter is climate change, because this is going to not only affect us, but I point out that the students that we are teaching now will be professionals in the next 20 to 30, even 40 years, who will be teaching people who will be alive in the year 2200 and beyond. So we have issues that we examine now, but they have far greater implications than just our lives and our careers, because we are all senior professionals, some of who are already emeritus and others who will be probably within 5 or 10 years at most. We also have international organizations. The issue is to what extent those international organizations can and will be able to move beyond some of the current geopolitical realities through education, the social sciences, and be able to help create not only better educational settings, as I say in another presentation, whether you're 2 years old or whether you're 99 years old. So these are some of the issues that will need to be examined very critically in comparative and international education and the social sciences, and moving into areas such as STEM and STEAM in this new 3rd decade of the 21st century. So thank everyone for participating.